Have you ever thought that the past could be the key to unlocking the future? Clint Eastwood, a cinematic legend, has proven that progress isn't about discarding the past, but learning from it and building upon it. In today's story, we'll follow the confrontation between Eastwood and a young reporter, where lessons of humility and wisdom forever changed the course of his life. Join us in exploring this inspiring tale, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating insights into Clint Eastwood. The ballroom at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel gleamed with opulence, its crystal chandeliers casting a soft, golden light over the crowd. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and aged whiskey, mixing with the subtle tension that always lingered in rooms where Hollywood's elite gathered. Guests, dressed in tailored suits and designer gowns, floated from table to table, their voices a hum of industry gossip and quiet laughter. Tonight, however, wasn't just another glamorous gathering. It was a gala in support of veterans' mental health initiatives, though for many, it was little more than a chance to network and reinforce their place in the industry's social hierarchy. Among the sea of well-dressed figures was one man who stood apart: Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, Eastwood's presence was commanding, though not in the boisterous way one might expect. There was no entourage, no grand entrance, just Eastwood himself, walking into the room in a well-fitted black suit, hands casually tucked into his pockets. His quiet confidence did not require fanfare. In a room filled with industry heavyweights and young hopefuls, he was the one everyone noticed, even if they didn't approach him. Brandon Keller, a young political journalist on the rise, watched Eastwood from across the room. Keller wasn't yet a household name, but his reputation as a fearless, no-nonsense critic of outdated conservative figures was growing. Tonight, Keller saw an opportunity, not for a meaningful conversation, but for a chance to make a statement, to take down a Hollywood legend. Keller had built his following by attacking what he deemed outdated ideologies, and he was convinced that Clint Eastwood, a man with a legacy of playing rugged conservative characters, symbolized everything wrong with Hollywood's past. He believed Eastwood was a relic of an era that no longer fit the modern narrative. The setup was perfect for Keller. This wasn't just about calling out an actor. This was about making a name for himself, about seizing the moment. With his phone ready to record, Keller straightened his tie and began making his way toward Eastwood. He was confident, perhaps too confident. He had a script in mind, and he was certain that, by the end of this conversation, the headline would read, "Clint Eastwood finally called out." As Keller approached the bar, the atmosphere shifted slightly. The guests nearby took a step back, sensing the impending disruption. Eastwood, mid-conversation with a war veteran, barely acknowledged Keller's presence. But that only fueled Keller's determination. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight-lipped smile, and spoke loudly enough to draw attention. "Mr. Eastwood," he began. "Brandon Keller, the Sentinel Review. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eastwood glanced at him briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his conversation. Keller didn't like the lack of acknowledgement. He took a small step closer. "I'll make it quick," he added, chuckling awkwardly. "I just wanted to get your thoughts on, well, Hollywood's changing landscape. You've been in the industry for over 60 years. Do you think people like you still have a place in it?" The subtle jab in Keller's question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The words, "people like you," were deliberate. He wanted to frame Eastwood as out of touch, as someone who didn't belong in a world that was moving toward progressive ideals. A few guests turned their attention toward the exchange. Someone set their drink down too loudly. Even the bartender paused for a moment, sensing the tension. Eastwood, however, didn't flinch. He looked at Keller with a steady gaze, as if weighing whether this moment was worth his time. The silence stretched, almost unbearable, before Eastwood finally spoke. "You rehearsed that one, didn't you?" Eastwood said, his voice calm but cutting. A ripple of chuckles went through the small crowd. Keller's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. He had expected a challenge, but not this kind of response. Eastwood wasn't rattled. Keller pushed on, trying to maintain control of the conversation. "You know," he continued, "Hollywood is evolving. The old ways of thinking, the outdated masculinity, the conservative values. A lot of people believe it's time to move forward. That guys like you are out of touch with what modern audiences want." There it was, the line Keller had been waiting for. He thought it was the perfect setup. Standing toe-to-toe with a Hollywood legend, he believed this moment would make him a star. But instead, it only exposed his arrogance. Eastwood didn't react in the way Keller had expected. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady as he delivered a pointed critique. "You think the world just moves forward because some guy with a keyboard says so?" Eastwood asked, his tone measured. "That real change happens because somebody like you points a finger and says, 'That's old, throw it out.'" Keller opened his mouth to respond, but Eastwood didn't give him the chance. "Let me tell you something, kid," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You don't erase the past just because you don't like it. You learn from it. You build on it. You take what worked, fix what didn't, and move forward. That's progress, not whatever the hell this is." As Eastwood gestured vaguely at Keller, mimicking the young journalist's earlier dismissive hand wave, the crowd chuckled again, louder this time. A few guests clapped. Keller's face reddened, but he wasn't ready to back down. Keller tried to hold on to his confidence, but the sting of Eastwood's words was evident. "With all due respect, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice a little tighter, "it's easy for you to talk about learning from the past when you were part of a generation that had it easier." The room went quiet for a moment, and a murmur ran through the crowd, not in Keller's favor. The bold, yet flimsy argument had failed to win the crowd over. Eastwood let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Easier," he repeated, as if the very idea was laughable. "I started in Hollywood when they still told actors like me to change their name because it sounded too rough. I worked as a bricklayer before I ever got in front of a camera. You think it was easier?" He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. "You ever had to shovel asphalt in the middle of summer just to afford a meal?" Keller blinked, momentarily stunned. He hadn't been prepared for that. But Eastwood wasn't done. "I've seen guys like you before," he said, taking another sip of his drink. "Looking for a soundbite, hoping to make a scene. But here's the thing. You walked in here thinking I was going to fold. That I'd get mad, stumble over my words, maybe even storm off. But I don't do performances on command. That's your job." The audience laughed again. Not just a few people, but nearly half the room. A few clapped. Keller could feel it. His confidence was cracking, and it was only going to get worse. Keller's final attempts to salvage the situation fell flat. His words became less sharp, more desperate, but Eastwood continued to assert his wisdom, teaching Keller the difference between performative outrage and real strength. As Keller left the room, humiliated and defeated, Eastwood simply resumed his conversation, unaffected by the drama. The crowd resumed their socializing, but the lesson lingered in the air. Tearing someone down doesn't make you important. Building something real does. In the end, the encounter between Brandon Keller and Clint Eastwood was a battle not between two men, but between arrogance and wisdom. Keller, representing the new generation of outrage and easy criticism, was humbled by Eastwood, who had lived through decades of change and adversity. The message was clear. Real progress isn't about tearing down the past. It's about learning from it and moving forward. The next morning, Brandon Keller sat at his desk, staring at his phone screen, still numb from the events of the previous night. The footage of his confrontation with Clint Eastwood had gone viral, but not for the reasons Keller had hoped. Headlines weren't praising his boldness. Instead, They mocked his failure to outwit the Hollywood icon. Social media was awash with memes and comments from both young liberals and older conservatives alike, all united in the same sentiment. Keller had tried and failed. The barrage of comments was brutal, and Keller found himself questioning everything. The sharp-witted journalist, known for his unrelenting takedowns of outdated figures, had been reduced to a punchline in the eyes of the very people he sought to impress. He had underestimated Eastwood, mistaking his calm demeanor for weakness. But as he scrolled through the endless posts, mocking his inability to engage with the seasoned actor, Keller couldn't escape the feeling that something profound had happened in that moment. The kind of experience that only happens when you face your limits. He leaned back in his chair, running his hand over his face, realizing that his approach had been flawed from the start. He had come into the conversation with preconceptions, with a narrative he had crafted in his mind before he even spoke to Eastwood. He had thought it would be easy to label the old guard as irrelevant and out of touch. But Eastwood's calm, collected response had shattered that narrative. Keller hadn't just been defeated in a debate. He had been forced to confront his own arrogance, his lack of humility in approaching someone with decades of experience. As the days passed, Keller's mindset began to shift. He found himself revisiting the conversation, reflecting on Eastwood's words, which had now taken on a deeper meaning. Keller had entered the conversation expecting a battle of ideals, but what he had faced instead was a clash of wisdom versus youthful idealism. Eastwood's words about learning from the past, about not simply erasing history, but building upon it, began to resonate with Keller. That afternoon, Keller sat down to write a piece, not about tearing down Eastwood or calling out Hollywood's past, but about the importance of perspective. He wrote about how progress isn't just about moving forward blindly. It's about understanding where we come from. It was clear to him now. The greatest challenge for the new generation wasn't just about pointing out the flaws in the old world, but about learning to navigate those flaws and use them to build a better future. Keller's article, titled "The Wisdom of Experience: What I Learned from Clint Eastwood," was met with a mix of surprise and praise. Readers who had followed him for his sharp critiques found themselves unexpectedly moved by his humility. For the first time, Keller wasn't just the critic. He was the one learning, evolving, and sharing that experience with others. As Keller's piece made the rounds, it became clear that his moment of humility was being recognized not just as a personal growth story, but as a reflection of something larger. The young journalist's ability to admit when he was wrong resonated with a public that, perhaps, had grown tired of the constant bickering between the old and new. The piece didn't just shine a light on Eastwood's wisdom. It shined a light on the value of humility and open-mindedness in an age where quick opinions often take precedence over thoughtful reflection. Meanwhile, Clint Eastwood, ever the enigmatic figure, never commented on the situation. He didn't need to. The impact of his words had already been felt. While Keller had initially set out to challenge Eastwood, the veteran actor had instead led him to a place of deeper understanding, both of himself and of the world around him. As the weeks turned into months, Keller began to find a new rhythm in his work. His articles became more nuanced, more thoughtful, and more willing to examine the complexities of issues rather than just the surface-level conflicts. The social media-driven culture of immediacy and soundbites was still prevalent, but Keller now understood the importance of patience, of listening before speaking, and of acknowledging that there are always lessons to be learned, regardless of how much you think you already know. For Clint Eastwood, life went on much as it always had. At 94, he was still the same quiet force, remaining largely out of the public eye, except for the occasional appearance or film release. His legacy was firmly cemented, not just as an actor and director, but as a symbol of the kind of resilience and wisdom that only comes with time. His quiet rebuke of Keller had not only humbled a young journalist, it had served as a reminder to everyone who heard the story that wisdom isn't something to be discarded or mocked. It's something to be respected and learned from. In the end, the confrontation between Keller and Eastwood was about far more than just a clash of ideals. It was a conversation about respect for experience, the value of learning from the past, and the humility it takes to acknowledge that one's perspective is not always the definitive truth. Keller's evolution wasn't just personal. It was a microcosm of the larger societal lesson that progress isn't about erasing the old, but rather about using it as a foundation to build something better. The lesson, though difficult for Keller to swallow at first, became the cornerstone of his career moving forward. Progress doesn't happen in a vacuum, and wisdom, often learned through failure, is the key to navigating the future. Clint Eastwood had quietly shown him that while challenging the past is important, understanding it, learning from it, is what truly allows us to move forward. As the years went by, Keller's relationship with Eastwood remained one of distant respect. Though they never spoke again, Keller knew that the legendary actor had taught him something far more valuable than a simple lesson in ideology. He had taught him about life, about the power of listening, and about the importance of balancing one's idealism with the wisdom of those who have walked the path before. In the end, Keller came to understand that true progress isn't just about pushing forward. It's about integrating the past into our vision for the future. It's about recognizing that those who came before us have something valuable to offer, something we can build upon, if we only take the time to listen.